The room fell completely silent as the cartel boss was strapped into the electric chair, the heavy leather belts tightening across his chest and arms, while guards stood on both sides watching every movement. Just minutes earlier, he had been shouting across the courtroom, challenging the judge who had sentenced him to death, his voice echoing through the chamber as chains rattled against the floor. Now the shouting was gone, replaced by the cold hum of electrical equipment inside the execution room. The harsh overhead light cast long shadows across the concrete floor as the heavily tattooed man sat restrained in the center of the chamber, wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, his arms locked tightly against the wooden armrests of the chair. Moments earlier, he had been escorted through the prison corridor by multiple officers, his shackles dragging across the concrete as the metal doors behind him slammed shut one by one. Witnesses had already gathered behind the thick, reinforced glass window, watching quietly as the guards guided him into the room where the electric chair waited beneath the hanging lamp. For years, the man sitting there had built a reputation as one of the most feared figures connected to a powerful cartel network, accused of violent crimes that stretched across borders and left investigators chasing evidence for years. Prosecutors described him as a man who had operated with absolute confidence, someone who believed he would never face consequences for the world he helped create. But the trial that followed painted a different picture, one that slowly built the case that would eventually bring him into this chamber. As the courtroom proceedings unfolded weeks earlier, witnesses took the stand, investigators presented their evidence, and the prosecution described the operations of the cartel that had spread violence and intimidation across entire regions. Throughout the trial, the defendant remained defiant, sometimes staring directly at the jurors and sometimes arguing loudly with attorneys, while the judge repeatedly called for order in the courtroom. Even when the verdict was finally delivered, he refused to show fear, shouting toward the bench as officers moved quickly to secure him in chains. Now that same man sat restrained under the bright execution light, while prison officials carefully carried out the final procedure. One officer checked the thick leather restraints around his wrists, while another prepared the metal execution helmet that would soon be lowered over his head. The chamber remained quiet, except for the sound of equipment being adjusted and the low mechanical hum coming from the electrical control panel mounted on the wall. Behind the glass window, the witnesses watched every step of the process, some leaning forward, while others sat motionless as the scene unfolded in front of them. The execution supervisor stood calmly near the center of the room, reviewing each step of the protocol with the officers responsible for carrying it out. The prisoner stared forward without speaking, his expression steady as the final preparations continued around him. The officer holding the helmet lifted it slowly and lowered the heavy metal cap over the prisoner's head, securing the strap beneath his chin, while another guard checked the connections attached to the chair. Across the room, another official moved toward the electrical control panel, where several gauges and switches glowed faintly beneath red indicator lights. He examined the readings carefully, confirming that the system was ready for the final stage of the procedure. In the witness room, the atmosphere grew heavier with every passing second as everyone watched the officials finish their work. The guards stepped back once the restraints were secured and the helmet was in place, leaving the prisoner seated alone in the center of the chamber beneath the bright overhead lamp. The execution supervisor looked toward the control panel and quietly confirmed that the protocol could proceed. The officer beside the switch placed his hand near the control lever while the chamber remained completely silent. The long shadow of the electric chair stretched across the concrete floor as the witnesses watched from behind the glass. The guards held their positions along the walls, and the final moment of the procedure slowly approached inside the cold execution room.